Sarah Martinez pulled her pickup truck into the parking lot of Westfield Elementary School, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp October morning air. She sat for a moment, watching other parents drop off their children, most of them hurrying past in expensive cars without a second glance at the weathered Ford that had seen better days. The truck had been her father's before he passed, and she kept it running more out of stubbornness than necessity. It reminded her where she came from, and, more importantly, what really mattered. Her daughter, Emma, bounded out of the passenger seat, backpack bouncing against her small frame. At 8 years old, Emma had inherited her mother's determination, but thankfully her late father's easy smile. She was the kind of kid who made friends with everyone, who saw the good in people even when they didn't deserve it. Watching her daughter skip toward the school entrance, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with loving someone so completely that their happiness became your entire world. Emma turned back and waved, her gap-toothed grin lighting up her face. Sarah waved back, waiting until her daughter disappeared through the school doors before allowing herself to really look at the building that had become the center of a growing storm in her life. Westfield Elementary looked like every other suburban school built in the last decade. Red brick, large windows, carefully maintained landscaping that spoke of a community with money and priorities. It was exactly the kind of place she dreamed of sending Emma when she was deployed in places where schools were targets and children learned to recognize the sound of incoming mortars. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years fighting in foreign countries to protect American freedoms, only to come home and discover that some Americans believe those freedoms came with conditions and fine print. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer, reminding her about today's school board meeting. The message was professional and encouraging, but Sarah could read between the lines. David Chun was a good lawyer, but he was also realistic. The case they were fighting wasn't just about Emma's right to attend Westfield Elementary. It was about whether the promises made to military families meant anything when tested against local politics and prejudice. She drove to the small house she rented on the other side of town, a modest two-bedroom that was all she could afford on her disability pension and the part-time income from her consulting work. The neighborhood was a mix of working families, retirees, and others who'd been priced out of the more desirable areas near the school. Her neighbors were good people, the kind who looked out for each other's kids and borrowed lawn mowers without being asked. But none of them had the connections or resources to take on the Westfield School District. Inside, Sarah made coffee and opened her laptop, scrolling through the familiar routine of job searches and client emails. The consulting work was steady but unpredictable. Companies hired her to assess security protocols, train personnel in crisis management, and occasionally to handle situations that required someone with her particular skill set. It paid well when it came, but it wasn't the kind of work that impressed school administrators who measured worth by zip codes and property tax contributions. Her phone rang, the number immediately recognizable. Marcus Thompson's voice filled the kitchen with its characteristic mix of authority and warmth. "Sarah, how are you holding up?" Marcus had been her commanding officer during her last deployment, the kind of leader who earned loyalty through competence and genuine care for his people. After leaving the Navy, he'd built a successful private security company, employing dozens of former special operations personnel. More importantly, he maintained the networks and relationships that made things happen in Washington and beyond. "I'm Fine. Marcus. Just getting ready for today's circus." I saw the local news coverage. Pretty one-sided reporting. Sarah had seen it too. The story painted her as an outsider trying to force her way into a school system that was simply trying to maintain standards. There had been quotes from unnamed parents expressing concern about disrupting the established community and protecting our children's environment. The subtext was clear, even if the words were carefully chosen. "They're not wrong about one thing," Sarah said, stirring her coffee. "I'm an outsider. I just thought that serving my country for 12 years might count for something. It does count, to the people who matter. Speaking of which, I've been making some calls." Marcus's tone shifted slightly, taking on the quality Sarah remembered from mission briefings. When Marcus started making calls, things happened. During their time together, she'd seen him mobilize resources and cut through bureaucracy with efficiency that would have impressed Fortune 500 CEOs. Marcus, I appreciate the support, but this isn't Afghanistan. I can't solve this with a direct action mission. Maybe not, but you're not fighting this alone. Do you remember Jake Williams? Sarah remembered. Jake had been a Marine Force recon operator who'd worked with their unit on several joint operations. Intelligent, methodical, and absolutely relentless when he believed in a cause. After leaving the Marines, he'd gone into politics, currently serving as a state congressman representing a district about 2 hours away. He's been following your situation. Turns out he's got some thoughts about school districts that don't honor their commitments to military families. He's also got some interesting friends on the state education committee. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a familiar sensation from the old days when intelligence reports started revealing weaknesses in enemy positions. What kind of thoughts? The kind that result in policy changes and budget reviews. Jake's scheduled to visit Westfield next week for a routine evaluation of how the district handles federal funding related to military family support programs. The implications were significant. School districts received substantial federal funding tied to their treatment of military families, particularly in areas with large veteran populations. If Westfield was found to be discriminating against military families, the financial consequences could be severe. There's more, Marcus continued. Remember Tommy Rodriguez? Another familiar name. Tommy had been a Navy explosive ordnance disposal specialist, the kind of person you wanted around when things got complicated and dangerous. He'd left the Navy to become an investigative journalist, specializing in stories about veteran issues and government accountability. He's been digging into Westfield's school board. Apparently, there are some interesting connections between board members and local real estate developers. The kind of connections that might explain why they're so concerned about maintaining certain neighborhood characteristics. Sarah set down her coffee cup, her mind automatically shifting into operational planning mode. This was how it had always worked in the military. Individual expertise combining into something more powerful than the sum of its parts. But this wasn't a military operation, and these weren't foreign enemies. Marcus, I don't want this to become some kind of vendetta. Emma has to live in this community. This isn't about vendetta, Sarah. This is about making sure your daughter gets what she's entitled to, what you earned for her, and making sure the next military family doesn't have to go through this. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen, looking at the framed photo on the counter that showed her unit after a successful mission in Syria. 12 men and women who had learned to trust each other completely, who had accomplished things that seemed impossible because they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible when the cause was right. She thought about Emma, who had never known her father except through photos and stories. Emma, who had spent her early years moving from base to base, adapting to new schools and new friends with the resilience that military children develop out of necessity. Emma, who deserved stability and the best education Sarah could provide. The school board meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening. Sarah spent the afternoon reviewing her notes, checking facts, and preparing her statement. She'd testified before Congress about military operations, briefed generals and admirals, and given presentations to heads of state. A small-town school board should have felt manageable by comparison. But this was different because it was personal. This was her daughter's future being decided by people who had never worn a uniform, never been away from their families for months at a time, never made the sacrifices that military service demanded. People who seemed to believe that patriotism was a flag decal on their car, rather than a willingness to put your life on the line for others. At 5:30, Sarah changed into her best outfit, a navy blue suit that she'd bought for job interviews and court appearances. It was professional without being flashy, authoritative without being intimidating. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not just a single mother fighting for her daughter's education, but a decorated veteran who had earned the right to be heard. The drive to the school district administration building took her through neighborhoods she couldn't afford, past houses with perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars in the driveways. These were the homes of people who served on school boards, who made decisions about which children deserved opportunities and which could be quietly shuffled aside. The parking lot was already crowded when she arrived. Sarah recognized several faces from previous meetings, parents who supported her case, others who had made their opposition clear, and a few who seemed to be there more out of curiosity than conviction. She also noticed several people she didn't recognize, including a few whose bearing and alertness suggested military backgrounds. Inside, the meeting room was arranged with the school board seated at a raised table facing rows of chairs for community members. The setup was designed to reinforce hierarchy and authority, to remind everyone who held the power in these proceedings. Sarah took a seat in the middle section, close enough to be clearly visible, but not so close as to appear confrontational. Board President Margaret Stillwell called the meeting to order with the kind of practiced authority that came from years of running meetings where her voice was the only one that truly mattered. She was an elegant woman in her early 60s, married to a successful real estate attorney, and had served on the board for nearly a decade. In her mind, Westfield Elementary's excellence was largely due to her stewardship and the standards she helped maintain. Tonight we'll be addressing the Martinez Residency Challenge, she announced, her tone suggesting this was an unfortunate but necessary task. We'll hear from both sides, and then the board will make its final decision. Sarah's lawyer spoke first, presenting a clear legal argument about Emma's right to attend the school based on Sarah's military service and the federal regulations that protected military families' educational access. David Chun was thorough and professional, citing relevant laws and precedents with the precision that came from extensive preparation. The district attorney responded with equally prepared arguments about residency requirements and the need to maintain enrollment limits. His presentation was polished and reasonable sounding, carefully avoiding any language that could be construed as discriminatory, while making it clear that exceptions couldn't be made without undermining the entire system. Then, it was Sarah's turn to speak. She stood and walked to the podium, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. For just a moment, she was transported back to briefing rooms and command centers where her words could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm a 12-year veteran of the United States Navy, a former Navy SEAL, and a mother. I'm here tonight because my daughter Emma deserves the same educational opportunities as every other child in this district." She spoke for 10 minutes, describing her military service without seeking sympathy, explaining Emma's educational needs without making excuses, and outlining the legal obligations that bound the district to serve military families. She talked about the sacrifices that military families made, not to guilt anyone, but to remind them of the social contract that existed between those who served and the communities they protected. When she finished, the room was quiet. Even some of the board members who had seemed dismissive earlier were paying attention now. But then Margaret Stillwell began asking questions that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with Sarah's fitness as a parent and community member. The questions came wrapped in polite language, but their intent was clear: to paint Sarah as an unstable outsider who couldn't provide the kind of stable home environment that Westfield families expected. That's when Sarah heard it. The soft chuckling from a group of parents sitting in the back row. The kind of laughter that said they were enjoying watching someone they considered inferior being put in her place. The kind of laughter that said they believed they'd already won. Sarah had heard that sound before, in rooms where powerful men thought they could intimidate her because she was young or female or because they outranked her. She'd learned to recognize it as the sound of people who had never been truly tested, who confused position with strength and authority with competence. The laughter continued as board member after board member asked increasingly hostile questions, as the meeting devolved from a legitimate discussion of policy into something that felt more like a show trial. Sarah answered each question professionally, but inside she felt the familiar shift that happened when she realized that diplomacy and reason weren't going to be enough. Margaret Stillwell was in the middle of asking why Sarah thought she could simply move anywhere she wanted and expect special treatment when the back doors of the meeting room opened. 3 men entered quietly, their movements so coordinated and purposeful that Sarah immediately recognized the pattern. 2 took positions near the side walls while the third walked down the center aisle, his steps silent despite his size. Sarah knew that walk, had seen it 1,000 times in tactical situations where confidence and controlled aggression were the difference between success and failure. The man approaching the front of the room was Jake Williams, though he looked nothing like the politician his bio suggested. He was wearing a simple dark suit, but everything about his bearing screamed military. Behind him, Sarah could see more familiar faces filing in through the doors. Tommy Rodriguez was there, along with several others she recognized from her days in the teams. But it was the man taking a seat in the front row who made Sarah's breath catch. Commander Michael Chun, no relation to her lawyer, had been her final commanding officer and was currently serving as a liaison between the Navy's Special Operations community and various government agencies. His presence here wasn't just personal support, it was an official statement. The laughter had stopped completely. In fact, the entire room had fallen silent as more and more people in dark suits and professional attire filled the empty seats. They weren't loud or dramatic in their entrance, but there was something about them that commanded attention. Perhaps it was the way they moved with obvious physical confidence, or the way their eyes continuously scanned the room with automatic tactical awareness. Margaret Stillwell had stopped talking mid-sentence, her face pale as she tried to process what was happening to her carefully controlled meeting. Jake Williams stood and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Mrs. Stillwell. I'm Congressman Jake Williams, and I'm here tonight as part of a state-level review of this district's compliance with federal education requirements for military families. I was hoping to observe tonight's proceedings." His voice was polite, respectful, but carried an undercurrent of authority that made it clear this wasn't really a request. Sarah watched as several board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly recognizing that their small-town political maneuvering had just attracted exactly the kind of attention they'd been hoping to avoid. Of course, Congressman Williams, Margaret managed, her voice noticeably less confident than it had been moments before. "We're always happy to welcome state oversight." Commander Chun stood next. "I'm Commander Michael Chun, United States Navy. I'm here in an official capacity to observe how this district handles issues affecting Navy families, particularly those who have served in special operations." The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had been a hostile interrogation of a single mother had suddenly become something else entirely, a public examination of how a school district treated military families, conducted under the watchful eyes of state and federal officials. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride and gratitude for the men and women who had chosen to stand with her. But she also felt something else, a cold anger at the people who had forced this situation, who had been so comfortable in their prejudice and power that they thought they could mistreat a military family without consequences. Margaret Stillwell attempted to regain control of the meeting, but her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Well, I think we've heard enough for tonight. The board will deliberate and announce our decision at next week's meeting." Jake Williams cleared his throat again. "Actually, Mrs. Stillwell, I was hoping we could address this matter tonight. You see, I have some concerns about how this case has been handled, and I think it would be beneficial to resolve them while all the relevant parties are present." Sarah watched as the school board members realized that their carefully planned rejection of her daughter's enrollment had just become a very public, very official examination of their policies and motivations. The comfortable certainty they'd felt moments before had evaporated, replaced by the growing understanding that they were no longer dealing with just one isolated military family. They were dealing with a community that looked after its own. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Margaret Stillwell's carefully controlled composure was cracking, her fingers gripping her papers so tightly that Sarah could see the white of her knuckles from across the room. The other board members looked like deer caught in headlights. Suddenly, aware that their routine rejection of a military family's request had attracted attention they never could have anticipated. Jake Williams remained standing, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. Mrs. Stillwell, before we proceed, I think it might be helpful if I shared some background information about why the state has taken an interest in this particular case. He pulled out a tablet and glanced at it briefly, though Sarah suspected he knew exactly what he was going to say without any notes. Over the past 18 months, my office has received multiple complaints about Westfield's treatment of military families. Families who were told their children couldn't attend schools in the district despite having every legal right to do so. Families who were subjected to additional requirements and scrutiny that weren't applied to civilian families. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't known about other families. She thought her case was isolated, perhaps just bad luck or a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. Now, I understand that school districts have legitimate concerns about enrollment management and residency verification. Jake continued, his tone reasonable but firm. But when those concerns seem to disproportionately affect families who have served our country, the state has an obligation to investigate. Commander Chin stood and added, from a Navy's perspective, we're particularly concerned about how this district treats families of special operations personnel. These are individuals who have made extraordinary sacrifices in service to our nation, often spending years deployed in dangerous locations. When they return home and try to establish stable lives for their children, they deserve communities that honor their service, not ones that create additional obstacles. Board member Robert Hayes, a local insurance broker who had been one of Sarah's most vocal opponents, finally found his voice. With respect, Congressman Williams, I think you may be misunderstanding our position. This isn't about military service. This is about maintaining the integrity of our enrollment policies and ensuring that all families follow the same procedures. Tommy Rodriguez, who had been sitting quietly in the third row, raised his hand. Mr. Hayes, I'm Tommy Rodriguez with the Veterans Affairs Accountability Project. I've been researching this district's enrollment policies for the past several weeks. Would you mind explaining why the Hendersons were allowed to enroll their child last year despite living in a rental property outside the district boundaries? Hayes's face flushed red. I don't recall the specific details of that case. How about the Morrison family or the Patels? All civilian families, all granted exceptions to residency requirements that seem to have been deemed impossible when applied to military families. Sarah watched as Hayes realized that his carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in real time. She thought about all the hours she'd spent wondering if she was being paranoid, if she was reading discrimination into simple bureaucratic procedures. Now she understood that her instincts had been correct and that her case was part of a larger pattern. Margaret Stillwell attempted to regain control. Mr. Rodriguez, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for these accusations. If you have concerns about our policies, there are proper channels. Commander Chin's response was immediate and sharp. Mrs. Stillwell, with respect, when military families are being systematically denied access to educational services they've earned through their service, every forum is appropriate. And I should mention that this conversation is being recorded for potential inclusion in a federal investigation into discriminatory practices against military families. The mention of federal investigation sent visible shock waves through the board. Sarah could see the moment each member realized that their local political games had potentially serious legal consequences. This wasn't just about one child's school enrollment anymore. This was about their careers, their reputations, and possibly their legal liability. Jake Williams consulted his tablet again. Mrs. Stillwell, I have here a letter from the State Department of Education expressing concern about this district's compliance with the Interstate Compact on educational opportunity for military children. Are you familiar with this federal law? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, of course. Then, You're aware that military families have specific protections regarding school enrollment, including provisions for children whose parents are transitioning between duty stations or establishing residence after military service? Sarah realized that what she was witnessing wasn't just support from her military community. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, planned with the same precision that had characterized the missions she'd run overseas. Jake, Tommy, Commander Chun, and the others hadn't just shown up tonight to offer moral support. They'd done their homework, gathered intelligence, and prepared for every possible response the school board might offer. Board member Linda Patterson, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke up. I think we need to consider postponing this decision pending a review of our policies. Margaret shot her a sharp look, but Linda continued. If there are questions about our compliance with federal law, we have an obligation to address those questions before making any decisions that could affect military families. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but Jake Williams wasn't finished. Mrs. Patterson raises an excellent point. However, I think we also need to address the immediate situation facing Emma Martinez. This child has been waiting months for a decision about her education, while this board has delayed and created obstacles that don't seem to apply to other families. He turned to address the full board, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm going to make a recommendation. Tonight, this board can vote to immediately enroll Emma Martinez in Westfield Elementary, pending a comprehensive review of her military family policies. Or the state can step in and conduct a formal investigation that will likely result in federal oversight of your enrollment decisions and potentially significant financial consequences. The choice was clear, and everyone in the room understood it. Margaret Stillwell looked around at her fellow board members, seeing in their faces the same calculation she was making. They could dig in their heels and face a fight they couldn't win, or they could retreat with whatever dignity they could salvage. But Sarah could see something else in Margaret's expression. Anger. The kind of cold fury that came from being outmaneuvered by people she'd underestimated. This wasn't just about Emma's enrollment anymore. This was about power and who really held it in this community. I think we need to discuss this matter in executive session, Margaret announced. We'll take a 15-minute recess. As the board members filed out through a side door, the main room erupted into conversation. Sarah found herself surrounded by the men and women who had come to support her, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden reversal in her situation. Marcus Thompson appeared at her side, his familiar presence steadying her nerves. How are you holding up? I can't believe you all did this, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. I thought I was fighting this alone. Nobody fights alone, Commander Chin said, joining their conversation. That's not how we work. When one of our people needs support, we provide it. When someone threatens one of our families, they're threatening all of us. Tommy Rodriguez was standing near the back of the room, speaking quietly into his phone. Sarah caught fragments of his conversation, something about deadlines and editorial boards. She realized he was probably filing a story about tonight's events, making sure that the school board's retreat was documented and publicized. Jake Williams approached their group, checking his watch. Sarah, how do you want to play this? We can probably force a vote tonight that goes your way. But I want to make sure you're comfortable with the approach. Sarah thought about it. 6 months ago, she would have been grateful for any solution that got Emma enrolled in school. But tonight had revealed something larger than her individual case. Other military families had been affected. There was a pattern of discrimination that went beyond simple bureaucratic inefficiency. I want Emma in that school, she said finally. But I also want to make sure this doesn't happen to other families. Whatever you think is best. Commander Chin nodded approvingly. Good answer. We handle the immediate problem, but we also fix the system, so there isn't a next time. When the board reconvened, Margaret Stillwell's demeanor had shifted. The hostility was still there, but it was now contained beneath a veneer of professional resignation. She knew she'd lost this battle, and she was already calculating how to minimize the damage. After discussion, the board has decided to approve Emma Martinez's enrollment at Westfield Elementary, effective immediately, she announced, her voice steady but cold. We will also be conducting a comprehensive review of our military family outreach policies to ensure full compliance with federal requirements. The announcement was met with scattered applause from the community members who had supported Sarah's case. But Sarah noticed that several of the parents who had been laughing earlier were now staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright hostility. She realized that while she'd won this battle, she might have made enemies who would remember this night for a long time. Jake Williams stood to respond. Thank you, Mrs. Stillwell. The state appreciates the board's cooperation in this matter. However, given the serious nature of the compliance issues we've identified, the Department of Education will be conducting a formal review of this district policies regarding military families. We'll be in touch with your administration to schedule that review. The threat was polite, but unmistakable. Tonight's victory was just the beginning, not the end, of increased scrutiny for Westfield's school board. As the meeting officially ended, Sarah found herself accepting congratulations and thank for people she'd never met. Several were local residents who had been watching the situation unfold and were pleased to see the school board held accountable. Others were military families from other parts of the state who had driven hours to show support. But it was the conversation with Maria Santos that really struck her. Maria was a Navy wife whose husband was currently deployed, trying to manage 2 young children while preparing for a move to the area. I was in a homeschool, Maria confided. After hearing about your case, I figured it wasn't worth the fight to try to get my kids into the good schools here. But maybe now things will be different. Sarah realized that her fight had inadvertently become a symbol for something larger. Military families across the region had been watching to see whether their service would be honored or whether they'd be treated as second-class citizens in communities that claimed to support the troops but balked when asked to prove it. As the crowd began to thin out, Commander Chin pulled Sarah aside. You know this isn't over, right? You won tonight, but Margaret Stillwell isn't the type to forget being embarrassed in public. You and Emma need to be prepared for some pushback. Sarah nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. What kind of pushback? Hard to say. Could be subtle. Emma having a harder time making friends, teachers being less supportive, social exclusion. Could be more direct. Complaints about your parenting, attempts to find violations of school policies, continued bureaucratic harassment. The prospect was sobering, but not unexpected. Sarah had learned long ago that winning battles sometimes created new enemies. So what do you recommend? Document everything. Keep detailed records of any interactions with school personnel, any problems Emma encounters, any signs that you're being targeted for retaliation. And stay connected with us. You're not in this alone. Marcus Thompson joined their conversation, his expression serious. Sarah, there's something else you should know. Tommy's investigation has turned up some interesting connections between the school board and local real estate interests. Apparently, there are some significant development projects planned for this area, and property values are a major concern. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. You think this was about protecting property values? Keeping out families that might lower the neighborhood profile? It's a theory, Marcus said. And if it's true, it means tonight's victory might have some unintended consequences. If the board has been working to maintain certain demographic characteristics in the school district, your success could be seen as a threat to larger economic interests. The implications were troubling. Sarah had thought she was fighting for her daughter's education, but she might have unknowingly challenged a much larger system of exclusion and economic segregation. Tommy Rodriguez appeared as they were finishing their conversation. Sarah, great work tonight. I want to let you know that my story about tonight's event will be running in tomorrow's paper, and I've got editors at 3 other outlets interested in the larger story about military family discrimination in suburban school districts. He handed her a business card. If anything happens, and I mean anything that seems connected to tonight's events, I want you to call me immediately. Documentation is going to be crucial going forward. As Sarah finally made her way to the parking lot, she felt emotionally drained despite the victory. The truck started on the second try, and she sat for a moment watching the last few cars pull out of the lot. Through the school building's windows, She could see custodial staff cleaning up the meeting room, erasing the physical traces of what had happened tonight. But the consequences of tonight's event wouldn't be so easily erased. Emma would start school at Westfield Elementary next week, but Sarah understood that their real challenges might just be beginning. She'd learned to recognize when an enemy was retreating to regroup rather than surrendering, and everything about Margaret Stillwell's demeanor suggested that tonight's defeat was being processed as a temporary setback rather than a final resolution. The drive home took her through neighborhoods where the houses grew smaller and the cars older, away from the manicured perfection of the district's most desirable areas. But as she pulled into her driveway, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Emma deserved to attend the best school available to her. She deserved to have her mother's service honored rather than dismissed. And tonight, a group of people who understood the true meaning of service had made sure those things happened. Whatever came next, they'd handle it the same way they'd handled everything else together. Emma's first day at Westfield Elementary started before dawn. Sarah stood in her kitchen, making coffee and listening to her daughter's excited chatter from the next room about her new backpack, new notebooks, and the possibility of making new friends. The pure optimism in Emma's voice was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, given what Sarah knew about the resistance they might face. "Mom, do you think Mrs. Johnson will like me?" Emma asked, bouncing into the kitchen with her backpack already strapped on despite having 2 hours before school started. Mrs. Johnson was Emma's new third-grade teacher, a 20-year veteran of Westfield Elementary, who had a reputation for being both demanding and fair. "I think Mrs. Johnson is going to love you," Sarah said, though she wondered privately how much the teacher knew about the circumstances surrounding Emma's enrollment. "Just be yourself, work hard, and remember what we talked about." They'd had several conversations over the weekend about how some people might not be entirely welcoming at first, but how that said more about them than it did about Emma. Sarah had tried to prepare her daughter without frightening her, walking the delicate line between honesty and age-appropriate optimism. The morning routine felt surreal after months of homeschooling and uncertainty. Sarah watched Emma brush her teeth and pack her lunch with the kind of methodical care that reminded her painfully of David, Emma's father. David had been a Marine sergeant killed by an IED during Emma's second year of life. Emma had no real memories of him, but she'd inherited his attention to detail and his stubborn determination to do things right the first time. The drive to school was different this morning. Instead of dropping Emma off at the curb and leaving, Sarah would be walking her daughter inside to complete the final enrollment paperwork and meet with the principal. She'd insisted on this despite the school's suggestion that it wasn't necessary. After months of fighting for this opportunity, Sarah wanted to personally hand Emma over to the school's care. The parking lot was busy with the controlled chaos of a new school year. Parents hurried past carrying forgotten lunchboxes and permission slips, while children reunited with friends they hadn't seen all summer. Sarah noticed several parents glance in their direction, some with curiosity and others with expressions she couldn't quite read. Word of the school board meeting had apparently spread through the community, though she wasn't sure what version of events most people had heard. Principal Janet Morrison met them in the main office, a woman in her 50s with the kind of professional warmth that came from decades of dealing with nervous parents and excited children. Sarah had met her briefly during the enrollment process and had been impressed by her directness and obvious competence. "Emma, we're so excited to have you join us," Principal Morrison said, crouching down to Emma's eye level. "Mrs. Johnson has been looking forward to meeting you, and I know you're going to love being part of our Westfield family." Sarah watched the interaction carefully, looking for any signs of reservation or discomfort. But Principal Morrison's enthusiasm seemed genuine, and Sarah began to hope that the administrative conflicts of the past months wouldn't translate into problems for Emma in the classroom. The walk to Mrs. Johnson's classroom took them through hallways lined with colorful bulletin boards and student artwork. Emma absorbed everything with wide-eyed excitement, occasionally squeezing Sarah's hand when something particularly caught her attention. Other children were arriving at their classrooms, and Sarah was relieved to see several of them smile and wave at Emma as they passed. Mrs. Johnson turned out to be a small, energetic woman with silver hair and laugh lines that suggested years of genuine enjoyment in her work. Her classroom was organized but welcoming, with reading corners and science stations that immediately captured Emma's attention. "You must be Emma," Mrs. Johnson said with a smile. "I've heard wonderful things about your academic work, and I'm looking forward to having you in our class." Sarah felt a knot of tension release in her chest. Whatever Mrs. Johnson's personal feelings about the controversy surrounding Emma's enrollment, she was clearly committed to treating Emma like any other student. "Can I show you your desk?" Mrs. Johnson continued, leading Emma to a spot near the windows where the morning light created a natural reading area. "I thought you might like to sit here, because I noticed in your records that you enjoy reading, and this is the perfect spot for someone who loves books." As Emma explored her new classroom and met some of her new classmates, Sarah completed the final paperwork with Principal Morrison. The forms were routine: emergency contacts, medical information, transportation arrangements. But Sarah found herself reading every line carefully, still not quite believing that this was really happening. "Mrs. Martinez," Principal Morrison said as they finished up, "I want you to know that Emma is welcome here. Whatever happened with the school board, my job is to make sure every child in this building gets the education they deserve. Emma's success is important to me personally." Sarah felt grateful for the principal's directness. "Thank you. That means more than you know. I also want you to know that if there are any problems, any issues with other parents, any suggestions that Emma isn't being treated fairly, I want to hear about it immediately. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I don't tolerate discrimination of any kind in my building." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Stillwell's daughter, Ashley, a fourth grader who walked into the office with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your mother runs the school board. Sarah watched as Ashley's demeanor changed when she noticed her, going from casual familiarity to careful politeness. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez," Ashley said with perfectly practiced manners. "I hope Emma likes it here." The words were appropriate, but something in the girl's tone reminded Sarah uncomfortably of her mother's controlled hostility. She wondered how much of the adult conflicts Ashley had absorbed, and whether Emma would face social challenges that reflected the political battles fought in school board meetings. The morning bell rang, signaling the start of classes. Sarah hugged Emma goodbye, fighting the urge to linger and oversee every interaction. Emma was excited and confident, ready to begin this new chapter of her education. Sarah needed to trust that the systems and people in place would protect and nurture her daughter, even if some of those same people had fought to keep Emma out. Walking back through the parking lot, Sarah noticed a group of parents standing near the main entrance, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw her. She recognized several faces from the school board meeting, parents who had either supported or opposed her case. The silence was awkward and pointed, making it clear that her presence was still a source of controversy. Mrs. Martinez, one of the parents, a woman in an expensive jogging outfit, approached with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am Jennifer Walsh. My daughter is in Emma's class." Sarah recognized the name. Jennifer Walsh's husband was a partner in one of the area's most prominent law firms, and the family lived in one of the neighborhood's most exclusive developments. She'd been one of the parents asking pointed questions about community standards during previous school board meetings. "I just wanted to welcome you to Westfield," Jennifer continued, her tone carefully neutral. "I hope Emma settles in well." "Thank you," Sarah replied, equally careful. "Emma's excited to be here." "Yes, well, third grade can be challenging. There are certain expectations, certain standards that the children need to meet. I hope Emma is prepared for the academic rigor." The implication was clear, that Emma might not be capable of keeping up with the school's standards, that her acceptance was charity rather than merit. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that came from being underestimated, but she forced herself to respond professionally. Emma's always been an excellent student. I'm confident she'll do well. Of course, Jennifer said with that same empty smile. Though I suppose military families move around so much that it's hard to maintain consistent academic standards. Children from different backgrounds sometimes struggle with adjustment. Sarah understood exactly what Jennifer was saying and what she wasn't saying. This wasn't about academic ability or adjustment difficulties. This was about class and belonging, about who deserved to be part of Westfield's community and who should be grateful for whatever scraps they were allowed. Before Sarah could respond, another parent joined their conversation. This was Dr. Lisa Chun, a pediatrician whose children attended the school and who had been one of the few community members to speak in support of Sarah's case at the school board meeting. "Jennifer, how nice to see you," Dr. Chun said with pointed politeness. "Mrs. Martinez, I wanted to let you know that my daughter Amy is in Emma's class, and she's been looking forward to meeting her. Amy could use a friend who shares her love of reading." The intervention was smooth and professional, but its effect was immediate. Jennifer's smile became even more strained, and she excused herself with the kind of hurried politeness that suggested she'd been outmaneuvered. "Don't let her get to you," Dr. Chun said once Jennifer was out of earshot. "Jennifer's just upset that the school board doesn't have as much control as she thought it did. Some of these parents have gotten used to thinking they own the school district." Sarah appreciated the support, but she was also learning that Emma's acceptance had created battle lines within the parent community that could complicate her daughter's social experience. Is this going to affect the kids? The tension between the parents? Kids pick up on more than we think, Dr. Chen admitted. But they're also more adaptable than we give them credit for. Emma seems like a confident, capable child. She'll make friends based on who she is, not on whatever drama the adults create. As Sarah drove home, she reflected on the morning's interactions. Emma's teacher and principal seemed genuinely committed to her success, which was the most important factor. But the social dynamics among parents were clearly complicated, and Sarah wondered how much of that would filter down to affect Emma's daily experience. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. "How did the first day drop-off go?" Sarah typed back. "Emma's excited, and the staff seems supportive. Some parent politics to navigate, but nothing unexpected." His response came immediately. "Remember, document everything. And call if you need backup." The reminder was sobering. Sarah realized that her support network was still actively monitoring the situation, still prepared to intervene if necessary. Part of her was grateful for their continued vigilance, but another part worried about what that said about the ongoing risks Emma might face. At home, Sarah tried to focus on work, but found herself checking the clock every few minutes. She'd spoken to Dr. Chun about the adjustment challenges that military children often faced, but she hadn't mentioned her own anxiety about letting Emma navigate this new environment without her protection. Around noon, her phone rang with a call from Westfield Elementary. Sarah's heart immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. Emma was hurt, or having problems, or facing some kind of discrimination that required immediate intervention. But it was Mrs. Johnson, calling with a routine update that she apparently provided to all parents on their children's first days. "I wanted to let you know that Emma is having a wonderful morning," the teacher reported. "She's already made friends with 2 other children in our reading group, and she volunteered to help another student who was struggling with our morning math exercise. She's a natural leader and a kind child." Sarah felt tears of relief and pride welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for calling. That means the world to me. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that I've been teaching for 20 years, and I can recognize a well-prepared, well-loved child when I see one. Emma is going to be just fine." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen and allowed herself to really feel the magnitude of what had happened. 6 months ago, Emma's educational future had been uncertain, threatened by bureaucratic obstacles and discriminatory policies. Today, Emma was thriving in exactly the kind of educational environment that Sarah had dreamed of providing. The victory felt complete, but Sarah understood that maintaining it would require ongoing vigilance. The parents like Jennifer Walsh hadn't suddenly changed their minds about military families belonging in their community. Margaret Stillwell was still school board president, still angry about being forced to accept Emma's enrollment. The systemic issues that had created the initial conflict hadn't been resolved, just temporarily overcome. But today, Emma was happy and learning and making friends. Today, the promises made to military families were being honored rather than ignored. Today was a reminder that sometimes the system could be made to work the way it was supposed to work when the right people decided to make sure it did. Sarah's laptop chimed with an email from Tommy Rodriguez. The subject line read, "Follow-up questions for military family education story." The message was brief. "Sarah, the piece about Westfield is generating significant interest from other outlets. I'm getting calls from military families in other districts who are facing similar challenges. Would you be willing to speak with some of them? Your case might be opening doors for changes at the state level." Sarah stared at the email for several minutes, processing the implications. She'd fought for Emma's right to attend Westfield Elementary, but apparently that fight had become part of something larger. Other families were watching, other communities were being forced to examine their own policies toward military families. The thought was both inspiring and daunting. Sarah had never intended to become an advocate or a symbol. She just wanted her daughter to go to a good school. But sometimes individual cases became catalysts for broader changes, whether the people involved wanted that responsibility or not. She thought about Maria Santos, the Navy wife who had been planning to homeschool rather than fight the district's resistance. She thought about the other military families that Jake Williams had mentioned, families who had faced similar obstacles without the support network that Sarah had been fortunate enough to access. Emma would be home in a few hours, full of stories about her first day and excitement about tomorrow's possibilities. Sarah wanted to focus on that, on the immediate joy of her daughter's success and happiness. But she also understood that her responsibility extended beyond just Emma now. Other children deserved the same opportunities that Emma was finally receiving. Other military families deserved to have their service honored rather than penalized. And if Sarah's case could help make that happen, then the broader fight was worth continuing. She opened a new email and began typing her response to Tommy Rodriguez, offering to speak with other military families and share what she'd learned about navigating discriminatory school policies. The fight for Emma's education was over, but the larger battle for military family rights was apparently just beginning. 3 weeks into the school year, Sarah's phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The caller ID showed Tommy Rodriguez, and experience had taught her that journalists didn't call that late unless something significant was happening. "Sarah, I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to give you a heads up before you see it in tomorrow's paper." Tommy's voice carried the urgent tone he used when breaking important stories. Margaret Stillwell resigned from the school board this afternoon, effective immediately. Sarah sat up in bed, fully awake now. Resigned? Why? Officially, she's citing personal reasons and wanted to spend more time with family. Unofficially, my sources tell me that Jake Williams' investigation turned up some very interesting connections between school board decisions and real estate development projects. Sarah felt a chill run through her. What kind of connections? The kind that involve federal fraud charges if they can be proven. Apparently, Stillwell and her husband's law firm have been coordinating with developers to maintain certain demographic profiles in school catchment areas. The idea was to keep property values high by controlling who could access the better schools. The implications were staggering. Sarah had thought her fight was about military discrimination, but it appeared she'd stumbled into something much larger, a systematic effort to use school policies as tools for economic segregation. Tommy, what does this mean for Emma? For the other military families? In the short term, it means your daughter's enrollment is secure and the school board is going to be very careful about military family policies going forward. In the longer term, it means there are going to be some significant changes in how this district operates. After ending the call, Sarah lay awake thinking about the chain of events that had led from her simple request to enroll Emma in school to the resignation of the school board president. She'd never intended to trigger a federal investigation or expose a corruption scheme. She just wanted her daughter to have access to the education she deserved. The next morning brought confirmation of Tommy's report, along with additional details that made the situation even more complex. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Stillwell's resignation, with a follow-up piece detailing the state investigation into the school district's policies. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and by evening it was being discussed on military family advocacy websites across the country. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she'd never anticipated. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests from reporters, policy researchers, and advocacy organizations. Military families from other states reached out to share their own stories of discrimination and to ask for advice on fighting similar battles. The attention was overwhelming, but it also revealed the scope of the problem Sarah had inadvertently helped expose. Military families across the country were facing barriers to accessing quality education for their children, often in communities that claimed to be patriotic and supportive of the troops. Emma, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the larger controversy swirling around her enrollment. She came home each day with stories about new friends, interesting projects, and the kind of academic challenges that made her excited rather than frustrated. Mrs. Johnson's classroom was exactly the supportive, stimulating environment that Sarah had hoped for. But the social dynamics among parents remained complicated. Sarah noticed that some parents who had previously been neutral or friendly had become noticeably cooler since Margaret Stillwell's resignation. There was an unspoken suggestion that Sarah had somehow been responsible for bringing unwanted scrutiny and federal investigation to their quiet community. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Conversation stopped when Sarah entered the school office. Parent volunteers for classroom activities suddenly had scheduling conflicts when Sarah offered to help. Emma was still making friends and succeeding academically, but Sarah felt increasingly isolated from the broader parent community. The situation came to a head during the school's fall festival, a community event that traditionally brought together families for an evening of games, food, and fundraising. Sarah had volunteered to help with the silent auction, thinking it would be a good opportunity to meet other parents in a more relaxed setting. Instead, she found herself working largely alone at the auction table, while other volunteers gravitated toward different activities. The few parents who did approach her were polite, but distant, treating her with the kind of careful courtesy usually reserved for potentially dangerous strangers. It was Dr. Chun who finally addressed the elephant in the room, approaching Sarah during a quiet moment at the auction table. "You know this isn't about you personally, right?" she said without preamble. "Half these parents are terrified that their own involvement in the school is going to be scrutinized now that federal investigators are looking at board policies." Sarah hadn't considered that possibility. What kind of involvement? Volunteer positions that come with unofficial influence over enrollment decisions. Donations that seem to correlate with admission exceptions for their children. The kind of soft corruption that wealthy parents use to make sure their kids get advantages without leaving obvious paper trails. The explanation made sense of the social isolation Sarah had been experiencing. She wasn't just the military mom who had challenged discriminatory policies. She was the person whose case had triggered an investigation that threatened the informal networks of privilege that many families took for granted. "Lisa, should I be concerned about Emma? About retaliation?" Dr. Chen considered the question seriously. "I don't think anyone would be stupid enough to target Emma directly, not with the federal attention this case has generated. But you should probably be prepared for continued social exclusion from certain parent groups." As if to illustrate her point, Jennifer Walsh approached their table at that moment, her expression carefully neutral but her body language radiating disapproval. "Dr. Chun, Mrs. Martinez," she said with forced politeness, "I hope you're enjoying the festival." "It's a wonderful event," Sarah replied, matching Jennifer's careful tone. "The silent auction items are impressive." "Yes, well, this community has always been generous when it comes to supporting our children's education," Jennifer said, the emphasis on this community making it clear that she didn't consider Sarah to be part of it. "Of course, some of us are concerned about how the recent unpleasantness might affect our ability to maintain the standards that make this district so special. Dr. Chin's response was immediate and sharp. Jennifer, the only unpleasantness I'm aware of is the discrimination that military families have faced trying to access the education their children deserve. I think most people would agree that addressing the discrimination is exactly the kind of standard we should be maintaining. The exchange was polite on the surface, but the underlying tension was obvious. Jennifer excused herself quickly, but not before giving Sarah a look that suggested this conversation wasn't over. "Welcome to Westfield Politics," Dr. Chun said once Jennifer was out of earshot, "where every interaction is a chess move and every conversation has 3 different meanings." Despite the social complications, Emma's academic progress continued to exceed expectations. Her teacher reports were glowing, her test scores were excellent, and she was developing friendships with classmates who seemed genuinely to enjoy her company. The education Sarah had fought so hard to secure was proving to be everything she'd hoped it would be. More importantly, Emma was developing the kind of confidence that came from being challenged academically while feeling supported socially. She was thriving in ways that went beyond test scores, becoming the kind of student who helped struggling classmates and volunteered for extra responsibilities. But the broader implications of Sarah's case continued to unfold in ways she hadn't anticipated. Jake Williams called regularly with updates on the state investigation, which had expanded to include other school districts with similar demographic patterns in their enrollment policies. Federal investigators were now looking at whether there was a coordinated effort to use school access as a tool for housing discrimination. The investigation had also attracted attention from military family advocacy organizations, who saw Sarah's case as an opportunity to push for stronger federal protections for children of service members. Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences, to participate in policy discussions, and to share her story with congressional staff members working on military family legislation. The requests were flattering, but they also represented a level of public attention that made Sarah uncomfortable. She'd never wanted to be a spokesperson or an advocate. She just wanted Emma to go to a good school. It was Marcus Thompson who helped her find perspective during one of their regular check-in conversations. "Sarah, you know that what you accomplished wasn't just about Emma, right? You've opened doors for military families across the country who are facing the same kind of discrimination." "I understand that," Sarah replied. "But I never asked to become a symbol for anything. I just wanted to be left alone to raise my daughter." "That's exactly why you're effective," Marcus said. "You weren't looking for attention or trying to make a political statement. You were just a military mom fighting for her kid. That's what makes your story so powerful." Sarah thought about the emails she'd been receiving from other military families, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking her for bringing attention to issues they'd been dealing with in isolation. She thought about Maria Santos, who had successfully enrolled her children in the district's gifted program after the school board's policy changes. She thought about the state legislation that Jake Williams was drafting to strengthen protections for military families' educational access. Her fight for Emma had become something larger than she'd intended, but the results were helping people who needed and deserved that help. The attention was uncomfortable, but the impact was meaningful. The realization came with both satisfaction and responsibility. Other families were counting on the changes that her case had initiated. Federal investigators were relying on her cooperation to build cases against discriminatory practices. Policymakers were using her story to justify new protections for military families. Sarah had never asked for any of this, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes individual acts of courage created opportunities for broader change, whether the person involved wanted that responsibility or not. A month later, the state's investigation concluded with findings that shocked even Tommy Rodriguez. The school board's coordination with real estate developers hadn't just involved Margaret Stillwell. It had been a systematic effort involving multiple board members, district administrators, and local business leaders. The goal had been to maintain property values by controlling school access, with military families being just one of several groups targeted for exclusion. The findings triggered a complete restructuring of the school board, new oversight procedures for enrollment decisions, and federal monitoring of the district's compliance with civil rights laws. Sarah's case had evolved from a simple enrollment dispute into a landmark example of how individual resistance to discrimination could expose much larger systems of inequality. Emma, still blissfully unaware of the broader implications of her school enrollment, continued to thrive in Mrs. Johnson's classroom. She'd made close friends, joined the school's reading club, and was already talking about trying out for the academic decathlon team when she reached middle school. For Sarah, watching Emma's happiness and academic success was validation that the fight had been worth it. But she also understood that the battle wasn't really over. Other families and other communities were facing similar challenges, and the systems that enabled discrimination were still in place in many parts of the country. The difference now was that Sarah wasn't fighting alone anymore. The network of support that had emerged during her case had evolved into something permanent, a group of advocates, investigators, and policymakers who were committed to ensuring that military family service was honored rather than penalized. As she watched Emma walk into school each morning, confident and excited about the day ahead, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. Her daughter was getting the education she deserved, but more importantly, other children were getting similar opportunities because of the doors that Emma's case had opened. Sometimes the most important battles were the ones you never intended to fight. 6 months after Margaret Stillwell's resignation, Sarah stood at the podium in the Westfield Elementary Auditorium, looking out at an audience that included many of the same faces she'd seen during that contentious school board meeting. But everything else had changed. Tonight was the district's first annual Military Family Appreciation Evening, an event that would have been unimaginable during the early days of her fight with the school board. The auditorium was filled with military families from across the region, local community leaders, and students from all grade levels who had prepared presentations about military service and sacrifice. Sarah had been asked to speak as the evening's keynote presenter, a role she'd accepted reluctantly, but with growing understanding of its importance. Her story had become more than just a personal victory. It had become a symbol of what was possible when communities chose to honor their commitments to military families. Emma sat in the front row with her classmates from Mrs. Johnson's third-grade class, wearing her father's Bronze Star medal on a ribbon around her neck. Sarah had given it to her that morning, explaining that tonight was about honoring all military families, including the father Emma had never known but whose service had made tonight's celebration possible. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, my daughter Emma, and I moved to this community hoping to build a stable life after years of military deployments and relocations. What we found instead was a school system that seemed to view military families as problems to be managed rather than community members to be welcomed. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Some were familiar supporters who had stood with her from the beginning. Others were parents who had initially opposed her case, but had since come to understand the broader principles at stake. A few were the faces of people who had fought against her, but were now present out of political necessity or genuine change of heart. Tonight, Emma is thriving in her second year at Westfield Elementary, but more importantly, dozens of other military children have enrolled in this district without facing the barriers that we encountered. The changes that have occurred here have become a model for school districts across the country. The applause was genuine and sustained, coming not just from military families, but from community members who had come to see the district transformation as something to be proud of rather than something to be endured. Dr. Janet Morrison, still the school's principal, took the podium next to present the evening's major announcement. The district had received a federal grant to create a comprehensive support program for military children, including specialized counseling services, academic transition assistance, and social integration programs. This grant was awarded specifically because of Westfield's leadership in addressing the unique needs of military families, Dr. Morrison explained. What began as a challenging situation has evolved into a national example of how schools can better serve the children of those who serve our country. Sarah felt a complex mix of pride and irony. The same school district that had fought so hard to exclude Emma was now being recognized nationally for its support of military families. The transformation was real and meaningful, but it served as a reminder of how much resistance had been overcome to reach this point. After the formal presentations, the evening moved into a reception where families could mingle and students could display projects they'd created about military service. Sarah found herself moving through conversations with parents who thanked her for the changes her case had brought about, teachers who shared stories about how the new policies had improved their ability to support military students, and community leaders who wanted to discuss expanding similar programs to other districts. But it was her conversation with Maria Santos that meant the most to Sarah. Maria's husband had returned from deployment, and both of their children were now thriving in Westfield schools. The family had become active in the parent community, with Maria serving on the newly created Military Family Advisory Committee. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you did changed everything for families like mine," Maria said, her voice emotional. "My children love this school, but more than that, they feel valued here. They feel like their military background is something to be proud of rather than something they need to hide." The comment highlighted one of the most important but least visible changes that had occurred. Military children in the district were no longer being made to feel apologetic about their family's service or their transient lifestyle. Instead, their unique experiences and perspectives were being recognized as valuable contributions to the school community. Tommy Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's shoulder, notebook in hand as always. His investigation of the Westfield case had launched his career as a nationally recognized expert on military family issues, and he was now working on a book about discrimination against veteran families in civilian communities. "Sarah, I wanted to update you on the legislative front," he said. Jake Williams' Military Family Education Protection Act passed the state legislature last month, and there are now 3 other states considering similar legislation based on the Westfield model. The policy changes were perhaps the most significant long-term result of Sarah's case. School districts across the country were now required to have specific procedures for supporting military families, with regular audits to ensure compliance. The kind of systematic discrimination that Sarah had encountered was becoming much more difficult to implement and sustain. Commander Chun joined their conversation, wearing his dress uniform for the evening's ceremonies. He had become a regular presence at military family advocacy events, using his position to ensure that the lessons learned from Westfield were being applied across military communities. "Sarah, I've been talking with school superintendents from 3 different states who want to implement Westfield-style programs," he reported. "Your case didn't just solve a local problem. It provided a roadmap that other communities can follow." As the evening wound down, Sarah walked Emma to their truck, both of them tired, but happy after a long day of celebration and recognition. Emma chattered excitedly about the friends she'd made from other military families, the projects she'd seen, and the stories she'd heard about military service. "Mom, is it true that some people didn't want to go to school here?" Emma asked as they pulled out of the parking lot. It was a question Sarah had been expecting, but dreading. She tried to shield Emma from the details of the discrimination they'd faced, wanting her daughter to experience school as a place of learning and friendship rather than as a battleground for adult prejudices. "Some people were confused about the rules," Sarah said carefully. "But the important thing is that everyone understands now that military families belong in their communities and that military children deserve the same opportunities as everyone else." "Like Amy Chun and Marcus Santos," Emma said, naming 2 of her closest friends who came from military families. "They're the smartest kids in our class." Sarah smiled at her daughter's matter-of-fact assessment. To Emma, her military background wasn't a source of conflict or controversy. It was simply part of who she was, like being good at math or loving to read. The normalization of military family experiences was perhaps the most important victory of all. At home, Sarah helped Emma with her homework and then sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the evening's events. The transformation of Westfield from a district that excluded military families to one that celebrated them was remarkable, but it had come at a personal cost that few people understood. Sarah's relationships with many community members remained complicated. While the district policies had changed and the official discrimination had ended, the social dynamics among certain parent groups remained challenging. Some families had genuinely changed their attitudes about military families, while others had simply learned to keep their prejudices private. More significantly, Sarah had discovered that fighting for justice often meant accepting a level of ongoing scrutiny and responsibility that never really ended. She regularly received calls from military families facing discrimination and other communities, requests to speak at conferences and policy meetings, and invitations to participate in advocacy efforts that could consume all of her time if she allowed them to. The attention was meaningful and the cause was important, but Sarah sometimes missed the anonymity of simply being a single mother trying to raise her daughter without becoming a symbol for larger social issues. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. "Great speech tonight. Proud of how far you and Emma have come." Sarah typed back, "Thanks for everything you did to make tonight possible. Emma's success is a team effort." His response came immediately. "That's what military families do. We take care of each other. Always." The exchange reminded Sarah of why the fight had been worth it, despite the personal costs and ongoing complications. Emma wasn't just getting a good education. She was growing up in a community that recognized the value of military service and the sacrifices that military families made. She was developing friendships with children from diverse backgrounds and learning to see her military heritage as a source of strength rather than difference. More importantly, other military children were having similar experiences because of the changes that Sarah's case had initiated. The systematic exclusion of military families from quality educational opportunities was becoming much more difficult to sustain both legally and politically. A year later, Sarah received an invitation that crystallized the broader impact of her fight for Emma's education. The Department of Defense was hosting a national conference on military family support, and they wanted her to participate in a panel discussion about civilian community integration. The invitation came with a letter from the Secretary of Defense, thanking her for her service and acknowledging how her advocacy had strengthened the relationship between military families and the civilian communities they serve alongside. Sarah read the letter several times, still finding it difficult to believe that her simple request to enroll Emma in a good school had evolved into national policy discussions and federal recognition. But the evidence was undeniable. Military families across the country were benefiting from stronger protections and better support systems because of the precedents established in Westfield. Emma, now in 4th grade, had become something of a leader among her classmates, organizing study groups and volunteer projects that brought together military and civilian children. Her teacher described her as someone who naturally built bridges between different groups, who helped new students feel welcome regardless of their backgrounds. Sarah recognized in her daughter the kind of leadership skills that military families often developed out of necessity. The ability to adapt quickly to new situations, to find common ground with diverse groups of people, and to stand up for others who were facing unfair treatment. The transformation was complete, but Sarah understood that maintaining it would require ongoing vigilance. The systems that had enabled discrimination against military families hadn't disappeared. They had simply been forced to operate more carefully and less openly. Future military families would need advocates who understood both the legal protections available to them and the political strategies necessary to enforce those protections. As Sarah prepared for the Defense Department conference, she thought about the advice she wanted to share with other military families facing similar challenges. The most important lesson was that individual cases of discrimination were often part of larger patterns that could only be addressed through collective action. Her fight for Emma had succeeded not just because her case was legally strong, but because it had revealed systemic problems that attracted the attention of policymakers and advocacy organizations. The support network that had emerged during her battle had evolved into permanent institutions that could assist other families facing similar obstacles. But perhaps the most important message was that military families belonged in their communities not as supplicants seeking charity, but as citizens demanding the rights and opportunities their service had earned. The laughter that had stopped that night in the school board meeting had been replaced by something much more powerful. The recognition that military families' contributions to their communities were valuable and deserved to be honored rather than merely tolerated. Emma would graduate from Westfield Elementary the following year, having spent most of her elementary education in a school system that celebrated rather than merely accommodated her military background. She would move on to middle school confident in her academic abilities, secure in her friendships, and proud of her family's service to the country. The education Sarah had fought so hard to secure had exceeded every expectation, but the broader changes that fight had created would benefit military families for generations to come. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that opened doors for others, even when that hadn't been the original intention. Sarah's case had started with laughter that needed to stop. It had ended with a transformation that needed to continue.